Well, hello again. This is an introduction to week 6 of Policy, Politics, and Law of Higher Education. I am excited about this particular section of the course because this is where I spent most of my career. I started as a classroom instructor. I felt there were problems that I could solve if I were a department chair, so I became a department chair. I still had problems, so I figured the source of the problems must be the dean, so I worked my way up through the administrative ranks until I reached the office of the president, where I served as an assistant to the president. And also I was functioning there as the secretary of the board of trustees. It was really in that role that I discovered that the problem was not so much lack of support from the president or the trustees, but a lack of understanding of the value of the college or the university by the general public and by the politicians who were elected to office by the general public. So I spent much of the rest of my career working as an advocate for community colleges in Illinois, and worked side by side with lobbyists who represented other sectors, all the way from the flagship University of Illinois to the private sector and even the for-profit sector. This week we'll be talking about the political environment in which college policies are shaped. Laws sometimes shape policies, and laws are created by politicians who have been elected to office, to the state legislature or to the Congress. And the question really for this week is what can colleges and universities do to improve their chances of success in the current political environment? Your assignment for Sunday is to produce 2 pages of remarks. That would be about 5 minutes worth of remarks that President Al Bowman might be able to use when he meets with the Senate Higher Education Committee. The legislative session in most states starts with the formation of committees. Committees work on budgetary issues pertaining to their particular topic. Higher education obviously would focus on state appropriations to community colleges and universities, and sometimes even private and independent and even for-profit institutions. The first stage of that process, of course, is to bring in representatives from those institutions, usually in the form of the president, and to have a conversation with the president about the institution's needs, and also the needs the state has of the institution. Sometimes institutions are brought into the crosshairs and forced to listen to some pretty severe criticisms. The current legislative session in Illinois is already beginning to move in that direction. Senator Martin Sandoval announced this week that he would be investigating the exorbitant salaries and benefits of university presidents. And the message seems to be from Senator Sandoval that maybe if colleges and universities were better stewards of the funds they receive from the state, they wouldn't always be coming back asking for more. The political environment in which community colleges and universities and for-profits and independents function is a tough one, but it always starts with a committee, and in Illinois it's that Senate Higher Education Committee that all the presidents will be visiting soon. And I just picked one university, one state university, Illinois State University, which is located in Normal, Illinois. If you Google President Al Bowman, you will find a copy of President Bowman's recent State of the University address, which contains all kinds of detail about the things that the university in Normal is doing. Of course, there's more material there than you could fit into a 2-minute speech, so you're going to have to cut that down. In fact, you might want to find additional material that isn't mentioned there. There's not much in that speech about what return on investment Illinois State University is providing for the $80 million that it receives from the state. What does it give back? How can people who are taxpayers in Illinois feel confident that the taxes they pay are being well used and that those taxes are returning additional wealth and well-being to the people of Illinois? That's the part that's missing from the state of the university speech, and that's the kind of thing I'd like you to think about including in President Bowman's remarks to the Senate Higher Education Committee. That committee is chaired by a gentleman who met with a previous iteration of this course. This fellow lives in the southwest suburbs of Chicago. Senator Edward Maloney made some remarks to a section of HEOC 725. We recorded those by videotape and put them on DVD, and you all should have a copy of that. So I think a good way to start week 6 is to look at the DVD of Senator Maloney and his remarks to the HEOC 725 students. He talks about how he got into politics. I think that's interesting. He talks about some of the frustrations. He talks about how nerve-wracking it is when people refuse to cut him any slack. He talks about the fact that he can't always support every cause or every bill that's brought to his attention, but that he is willing to listen. I think the message is as long as people stay on their best behavior. And he talks about how various organizations and interest groups try to sway the legislature. In fact, he credits the Farm Bureau with a better job of that than higher education, and that comes toward the end of his remarks. Make sure you notice the fact that he feels unattended to really by higher education. What is it that higher ed isn't doing that it could be doing in order to develop more support in the legislature? Senator Maloney is a Democrat, and for that reason kind of a natural constituent for public institutions. And we'll talk about that in a minute, the fact that Democrats tend to believe that government can take tax dollars and do good for the public that pays those tax dollars into the state. Senator Maloney's counterpart on the Republican side in that committee is Brad Brzezinski. Brad Brzezinski attended a private college, Illinois Wesleyan University, and then was, after training or educating himself as a music teacher, taught in the public schools in southern Illinois in a relatively poor area of the state, became a Farm Bureau region manager, and then transferred to eastern Illinois, where he worked in another county for the Farm Bureau. Eventually, he ended up in north central Illinois and was elected to the legislature, and he's been in the state senate for quite some time. He is the minority leader in this committee, and if the Republicans should take control of the state senate in Illinois, he would be the committee chair. So he works with Senator Maloney to kind of set the agenda for the committee, and he will also be listening to President Bowman make his remarks on behalf of Illinois State University. Now let's talk a little bit about how politics works and how academic leaders such as President Bowman might best be able to make a good case for the institutions that they represent. First of all, let's start by saying there's a long-standing philosophical division in the two major parties in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans. The Democrats, for at least 100 years, have favored government programs and government agencies, thinking that government is basically able to do good things for people. It can take tax dollars and return wealth to the community by putting the unemployed to work, by educating those who need to be trained and educated for jobs and for a better life. The Republican Party is skeptical, and has for a long time been skeptical about government programs, thinking that sometimes there's a lot more that goes on in a government program than actually produces results. And the philosophical bent of the Republican Party, especially these days, is that dollars would be better left in the taxpayers' pockets, where private entrepreneurs could do more with the dollars than government employees could possibly do. In Illinois, politics can be rough and tumble. When President Obama was running for the presidency a couple of years ago, he quoted a maxim in Chicago political circles: politics ain't beanbag, meaning that there are a lot of sharp elbows, personal attacks. It's a difficult environment for people to function in when they're thin-skinned. It's for people who have thick skins and who are willing to go right up to the line in terms of using tactics that some would consider questionable. A good example would be to run somebody against an opponent in the opponent's primary who has the exact same name. For instance, if I'm the incumbent and Jim Smith files against me and Jim Smith has a chance of unseating me, all I have to do is go to the other party's primary with another candidate who's also named Jim Smith, hoping that they'll split the vote and a lesser candidate will be elected to represent the other party, and then I can prevail in the general election. That's a trick that I've actually seen used more than once in Illinois. They also count very carefully the number of names on nominating petitions. You can lose your nomination if your nominating petitions aren't bound together with a staple. If you just turn them in loose leaf, you violated one of the rules of the nominations process in Illinois. And we have a lot of folks in Illinois who work full-time as election lawyers. In fact, in the Bush-Gore debate or controversy back several years ago in Florida, where it was considered on the part of the Republicans a mistake to go ahead with a recount. Of course, the Democrats wanted to go ahead with a recount so that Gore could become the next president of the United States instead of George W. Bush. When all of that took place, a good many of the lawyers who were brought to Florida to pursue the case on one side or the other were election lawyers from the state of Illinois. Because of this less than pure situation in American politics, some colleges and universities try to avoid politics altogether. The best example that I could give you is Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, which for a long time has taken no money from state government, no money from the federal government. The students who attend there may get scholarships, but they're never funded by state or federal government. And in that way, Hillsdale feels that it's been freed from the sullying effects of involvement with politics. And yet, Hillsdale is definitely the outlier in that. Most colleges and universities do have some involvement with politics, and so the question that I would have for you is, if political involvement of the college is inevitable, how can it best be done? Now, a couple of things about how politics works these days. I'm going to talk about two things. First of all, a wedge issue. A wedge issue is an issue that, or a question that you can bring up that splits your opponent's supporters and brings some of them over to your side. The best example of that I could give is that if I'm let's say I'm a Republican running against a Democrat, and I notice that a good many of the Democratic opponent's supporters are African Americans, say 30 or 40% of the supporters are African Americans, I might start to raise the issue of gay marriage or abortion in hopes that the social conservatism of the black churches would pull some of those voters away from supporting my opponent. Democratic opponents generally support liberal policies related to the family, and that involves the right to terminate a pregnancy and the right of gay couples to marry, or at least enter into some sort of recognized civil relationship. There is, on the part of the black churches, a real uneasiness about this. And if I can throw those issues out and cause some of the black supporters of my opponent to pull away from his candidacy, I increase the chances of my success in the campaign. That's how a wedge issue can be used to split the opponent's supporters and pull some of them over to my own side. The other tactic that I'd like to talk about besides wedge issues is framing, how to frame an issue. The idea here is that you can take anything that goes on in higher education and describe it in one context or another. Let me use financial aid as an example. What is financial aid anyway? Is it a freebie? Is it a giveaway? Is it something for nothing? That would be one way to characterize it if you wanted to reduce support for it. Or is it a chance to provide opportunity to the disenfranchised? If I were to frame financial aid and I were an opponent of it, I didn't want to spend any money on it, I would question whether or not it really had any effect, whether people really deserved it, whether folks who spend a lot of their money on pizzas and marijuana really deserve to have financial aid. I'd certainly point out the fact that a lot of people who receive financial aid drive cars better than the one that I'm driving, and that sort of thing. So by framing the issue in a certain way, you can move the voters and the politicians who represent the voters in one direction or another. Now one feature of contemporary 21st century American politics is the rise of extremism, or the increase of extremism in both parties. And here's why that's happened. About 20 years ago, both parties became very adept at drawing legislative maps. Every time there's a census, the legislative maps, the congressional maps have to be redrawn. And the computer makes it possible to do this redrawing with great precision, so that you end up creating just the kinds of districts that your party prefers. You want to have a greater chance of controlling the legislature and legislative issues in the future, so you want to draw the map in such a way that you produce as many safe candidates for your side as you can, and then you take all the people who lean toward the other party and you lump them into just a few districts, and that way all the districts of the map, once you're finished, are what we would call safe. That is, if they're Democratic districts, a Democrat is almost sure to win, and if they're a Republican district, a Republican is almost sure to win. Now, if the Democrats are drawing the map, they'll create some Republican districts, and they'll try to put as many Republican-leaning people, and they can judge that through demographic polls, into those districts as possible. In other words, into every life a little rain must fall, but you can put it in just a couple of barrels, and that way you'll always have more barrels of rainwater than your opponents will, and you can prevail in the legislature on all kinds of votes, and that will mean success for your party, at least for the next 10 years. Now, the consequence of this safe map drawing is that the only real danger you face if you're, let's say, a Democrat, is an attack from the left, the far left. Nobody is going to come in from the right side and say a conservative Democrat and take you down. At least it's less likely that that's going to happen, because after all, it's a safe district. It's been created to attract and serve Democratic voters. Most of the people in this district are Democrat leaning anyway, and the only way that you could possibly lose in a primary would be to lose from the left. With the Republicans, it's just the opposite. Really the same, but the threat comes from the opposite side. Republicans are certainly going to be elected. It's unlikely that a more liberal Republican would be able to successfully challenge a socially conservative Republican. After all, the demographics have been used to create a safe district where most of the people are fairly conservative. But if the person who's the incumbent starts to vote for a few Democratic proposals, and that track record is exposed to the public, then he can be successfully, or she can be successfully challenged from the far right. And as a consequence, we get more and more people elected from the far right and the far left, and there's very little of the middle left. It makes it harder for the parties to work collaboratively collaboratively with each other as they used to do. And collaboration being a thing of the past means that the contentiousness increases in the legislature, and it's harder and harder for the legislature to get its work done. Now, in the past, Democrats have supported higher education in general because they saw it as a service to the disadvantaged. If there were a poor person in my county, he can go to the community college, improve his life, and that makes the public support through tax dollars of the community college worthwhile. In the past, the GOP supported the same educational institutions because they saw them as serving people who were industrious, hard workers, and who had achieved a margin of excellence. So in the past, higher education could expect support from both the left and the right. It's not so easy to expect that today. As a matter of fact, it's not so realistic to expect that kind of support today, because Democrats realize that sometimes there are more urgent needs, health, welfare, housing, prisons, than the needs of higher education. And so what used to be taken for granted, support on the Democratic side, is not there. Republicans are pretty sure that there are a lot of people in college who don't deserve to be there, and that college isn't for everyone. So their support is not as strong as it used to be. The idea that if you're in college you must be a high achiever, a hard worker, all that's been called into question by so many people that the Republicans have begun to lose a little bit of faith in higher education. And it's in that context that President Bowman must frame an introductory statement to the Senate Higher Education Committee. And he needs to frame a statement that both parties will find attractive. That is, he needs to say some things and get right to it. He doesn't have much time for flowery language because he only has 5 minutes. He has to get right to some points that will score him some points with both Democrats and Republicans. Just to compound the difficulty, the states are mostly broke. Most of the states are in a deficit situation. Illinois and California are the most in debt right now, in deficit. Illinois has about a $15 million annual deficit, and that's about a third of their annual budget total. Now, just use your own experience as a wage earner in comparison to that. Let's say you've taught in a high school and you made $30,000 a year, just using that as a round figure. That would mean that every year in your own personal budgeting you had a $10,000 gap. That is, you were spending $40,000 and you were only making $30,000. And I'm talking about your net, not your gross. It's nice to have a $30,000 net income. That's better than nothing. But it's not so good if you're actually having to spend $40,000 a year. That's not good, and that's exactly the kind of situation that the state of Illinois is in. As a result, this year in 2011, Illinois State University took about a 5% reduction, or about a $5 million reduction, and this year they're only able to draw from the state something in the order of $80 million when the figure used to be much higher. Now, in a situation like that, in an environment like that, what would you say if you were the college president, if you had 5 minutes to spend with the 12 members of the Senate Higher Education Committee? Could you find exactly the right words and the right metaphors? Could you talk about return on investment? Could you frame the issues in such a way that you turn the discussion to your own advantage? And is there any way you could use wedge issues to somehow split the support for other causes that the legislators might want to spend the money on? Tax relief would be one, for example. Republicans love tax relief and would rather reduce the tax burden if possible. Is there anything that Senator Bowman could say or imply that would split the Republican support for tax relief in Illinois at a time when there's a desperate shortage of tax dollars, a desperate shortage of state revenues, and as a consequence, a continued slide in the state's level of support for its institutions. Well, that's the challenge for this week. I know you'll be up to it. We're not going to actually send these papers that you submit on Sunday night to the president at Illinois State University. But if he calls me, I'll tell him that we have been conducting this exercise, and that a conversation with your class might not be a waste of time as far as he's concerned, because he is going to have to go through this annual ritual in the next couple of weeks, and he's going to need the kind of inspiration that you could provide. I don't expect him to take us up on that offer. In fact, I don't expect him to call looking for help. But it's the kind of situation that you may very well find yourself in the next few years, either as a college president or a member of the cabinet who's working with the president to provide the kind of statement that will elicit the desired response from the legislature. I've watched presidents do this for years. I've always been surprised at how ineffective they've been as a group. Some are pretty good, but most come in and say exactly the wrong thing. You'll see in the assignment that you're going to read on lobbying at the federal level how federal lobbying has often been misguided and produced negative results. So it's a common problem. It's hard for higher education leaders to be politically savvy because they don't spend most of their time in political circles. Here's where the ivory tower really does us a disservice. But after looking at some of the source material that we provided this week through the Angel site, I think you'll be able to come up with some good suggestions for the president, and that's what we'll be looking for in your submission, which is due, by the way, on Sunday evening at midnight. If you have any questions, you know how to get hold of me. I'm looking forward to following some of your discussions on your discussion page, and I wish you well in your week for week 6 of Policy, Politics, and Law in Higher Education.